Well, good morning. It's good to see everybody today. I want to give one quick word about some dates that we would love to have you hang on to 1 year from now. Many of you know that every other year we head up into the mountains of Colorado. Anybody who wants to join us is welcome to come up for Summit. And so we are already gearing up for Summit 22. And it is going to be 1 year from today, actually. It's going to be August 1st through 3rd, 2022. We're still kind of nailing down exactly where Summit 22 is going to be. Appreciate all the work that Robert and Kathy Elliott do on that. But we know that it is going to be August 1st through 3rd, and so circle those dates. Some of you have already been doing it. I've been getting a lot of questions about that lately, which is awesome. I'm excited about that. Maybe you've never been to Summit. Next year would be a great chance to do it. It's fun, it's refreshing, it's relaxing. You meet new people, you hang out with old friends. It's a really cool time. And so August 1st or 3rd next year. We hope you'll hang on to those dates. All right, so does anybody else have anxiety dreams where you're supposed to do something important and you just realize that you're terribly unprepared for it? Maybe it's taking a test or giving some sort of a presentation or doing a performance of some kind. Show of hands. Anybody else ever have those? Okay, I'm seeing a few hands. That makes me feel at least a little bit better because I certainly have those. I have these things and I hate them. Usually they'll pop up during a particularly busy time, or maybe there's a big project going on at work and they're awful. I can't stand these dreams. And so mine are always focused around taking some big final exam or passing an important class, and throughout the course of the dream, I've either been procrastinating just hard, just skipping classes left and right, until those panicked moments, where I realize that I'm about to fail, or I don't realize at all. I have no awareness that I've actually been enrolled in this big class for an entire semester, and somebody rushes up to me and says, "You've been in the class the whole time, and now you got to take the final," and I don't know any of the material. And then I wake up crying and in a cold sweat, and it's just a lovely way to start a day. And for me, at least, these recurring nightmares, and I would call them that, these nightmares go all the way back to college. That's when they started. And so I'd like to echo Brian and Scott in welcoming our incoming college students this morning. You're in for such a treat. It's going to be a blast. I do want to echo them. We are thrilled by any incoming students this morning. We're so glad you're here. It is going to be kind of the time of your life, and we hope that you'll make Memorial Road your home away from home while you're in school. And if you do happen to wake up sweating in the middle of the night, call me, because I will be awake, afraid to go back to sleep, and we'll talk it out. I just make that invitation to you. So in the same vein of unpreparedness, I was at Sunday lunch with the fam a couple of weeks ago, and I tossed out that question. I said, tell me some stories of a time where you were unprepared for the moment and then you had to face the consequences of that. And man, the floodgates opened. There was no shortage of stories on that front. My granddad was eating with us, and he chimed in. He was talking about how he had played football in his small town in high school and had some success at that, and just figured that he would walk on to the college team, no problem, and do that for 4 years and enjoy playing football in college. And after doing head-on blocking for a week with guys 100 pounds heavier than him, he kind of had the realization that track might be a better fit for him. And so he shifted his interest a little bit. I was remembering back to the 7th or 8th grade when I showed up at the Oklahoma State Spelling Bee. Yes, I did. I made it to the Oklahoma State Spelling Bee. I know you're all very impressed. And I walked in the room. I'd had the little booklet. They give you this little booklet of words, and I'd kind of looked over that a few times thinking that would suffice for my prep work. And then I walk into the room where all the other participants are, and I immediately see that I'm the only one that doesn't have this giant, 3-ring binder full of exhaustively compiled materials that have obviously just been studied over and over and over again, and I instantly realized, oh, okay, well, this is not going to go very well at all. And it didn't. It was terrible. It was really embarrassing. You can ask my parents at some point how I handled that embarrassment. I was not a picture of graceful defeat in that moment, if you can imagine, and I'm sure they would be happy to share that story with you, but I was terribly unprepared. My mom told this story, I got to say, this kind of cringy story that I'd never heard before about transferring to a Texas high school where cheerleading was a really big deal. And she had been a cheerleader at her previous school in New York, but was completely unaware of and unprepared for the kinds of gymnastic feats that were required to make this new team in Texas. And so we were all just kind of wincing and recoiling and kind of watching through our fingers as she told this kind of brutal story of trying out in front of everybody for this team. She had none of those moves in her arsenal. It did not go well. And as she told that story, it became kind of clear that she's still not over it, really. And I have to tell you, Mom, I think the dream's dead at this point. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm sorry. I hate to tell you that. But it was rough. It was a rough story. My brother-in-law, Lucas, shockingly had a bunch of stories that he wanted to share. And I really liked one of them where he talked about having been asked to perform for a bunch of young kids, grade school age kids, but he was really unready for the sheer number of small kids that piled into this cavernous gymnasium to hear some jokes and listen to some banjo, as kids love to do. And at one point during the performance, one of them kind of discreetly got his attention and leaned in and just said, "You're not very good at this, are you?" Which is perfect. So the point of me telling all of those stories, that whole series of stories, is this. My family is just really ill-equipped to handle most every situation, apparently. And we routinely overestimate our own abilities. And so do not, under any circumstance, ask one of us to do anything, because we will not be up to it. I'm just going to tell you right now, we will let you down. That is my promise to you. That's the first point. The second point is maybe you can relate to at least a little bit of that. I'm hoping so. We can probably all come up with some time in our life where we just felt woefully unprepared. And sometimes those moments are pretty low stakes, there's not a whole lot that comes out of that, not a lot of consequences to face. But at other times, the consequences of being unready are awfully serious. And so today, as we continue our study of Paul's letter to the Ephesians, the text is going to lead us to examine how prepared we are to face the spiritual moment, as it were. We've been calling this series On Purpose, as you can see, and that's really apt, I think, for our topic today, because God is calling us in Ephesians chapter 6 to a life of intentional readiness, to be a people who are equipped and able to stand up to a challenge. And so, as we arrive at Ephesians chapter 6, this is really Paul's kind of final bit of teaching before he signs off the letter with some personal greetings here in just a little bit. So this is the culmination of the book, and it's a passage that's going to be very familiar to a lot of us. Paul, to this point, has been focusing on establishing the divine plan, God's divine plan, and his purpose in that, the kingship of Jesus, this revelatory call to unity in the church, and in the most recent chapters, some various aspects of Christian living where believers should aim to grow and to mature into more Christ-like beings. And so it's right on the heels of this incredibly inspiring exhortation that Paul speaks to the question of what is standing in the way of that goal for each of us. He says, Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Now, Paul's going to expound on that in the subsequent verses, and of course, we'll look at those as well. But really, in these two sentences right here, he's giving us the full scope of what he wants us to understand. One, we're in a battle against a supernatural evil. And two, God's power can and will be enough for us to defeat that enemy. That's what he wants us to know. That's this morning's lesson in a nutshell. So if you're planning to nod off here for a few minutes, that's all right. I'm glad you got that part. And it's after spending nearly the entirety of his letter reminding his audience of their higher calling and how to live into that Paul is essentially saying here, look, I've told you what God has designed. I've told you how to live to that standard. And now I'm telling you definitively that you can indeed do exactly that. It's not going to be easy because Satan himself wants you to fail, and he's going to be trying to make that happen. But I am telling you, God provides you what it will take to come out the other side. Not only healthy, or not only intact, but healthy and well and ready to face the next hurdle, ready to move forward. That's what he's telling us here in Ephesians chapter 6. So let's read a little bit more, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it has to say to us. Backing up to where we started from. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. As we dig into this passage about the armor of God for a few minutes, let's start by clarifying what Paul is and is not saying here, because I think that this particular section of Scripture has probably been twisted, maybe misdirected a little bit at times by both ancient and modern believers. But this passage is primarily about defense against unseen spirits, not offense against fellow mankind. It's about defense, not offense. It's about spirits, not mankind. Now, to be clear, there's lots of go and proclaim texts in the New Testament. Paul writes a lot of those. He is a living testimony of that calling. We know that going is a part of our mandate as Christians. It's just that this particular teaching isn't primarily about going. It's about standing. I think that's pretty clear in Paul's words, actually, right here as we read them. And yet, I suspect that there's some reasons, even some perfectly understandable ones, why readers at times have pulled a different lesson from it, or maybe applied it in a way that didn't really fit its intent. For one thing, perhaps it's just there's more allure to offense as opposed to defense. You know, maybe we're just wired that way. We want to compete. We want to win. And then you start throwing in this war imagery, the shields and the swords and the breastplates and all of that, and we start hearing the Braveheart speech in our heads, and we're ready to suit up and rush the battlefield and take on all comers. All comers that we can see, that is, because that's the other thing about this. Anytime we start talking about demons and angels and spiritual forces and all of that, there's some of us that have just a really hard time going there. It's so much easier, of course, to deal with what we can see and touch and feel and physically confront. And so we end up taking this memorable, rousing text that's actually about standing our ground in the face of forces unseen, and we make it about pressing the attack against people we can see. And while those inclinations might be understandable, it doesn't mean that they're not potentially really damaging to the cause of Christ. You know, the Crusades were not a feather in the cap of Christendom. You know, the torched abortion clinic doesn't help anybody to find God. And those are extreme examples, yes, but sometimes in our very human desire to just win all the time, we end up identifying the wrong enemy, and we very much miss the forest for the trees. There's an awful lot of that going on right now, I think, and Christians very much are included in that. So it's important for us to see any biblical text, not just this one, any text, for what it's actually trying to teach us. This one's trying to show us the value of a prepared and ready defense. And it's trying to remind us who the real enemy is. And actually, Paul's been laying the groundwork for this discussion of who the real enemy is throughout the letter. In fact, right off the bat, in the very third verse of the first chapter, we see Paul talking about, making mention of being blessed in, again, this phrase, the heavenly realms, with every spiritual blessing in Christ. And then he reinforces that theme again at the end of the same chapter, talking about Christ being raised from the dead and seated at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every title that can be given, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. So big concepts that he's trying to get across here. In chapter 3, Paul writes about God working through the church to make his wisdom known to the rulers and authorities, again, in the heavenly realms. according to his eternal purpose, which is actually directly foreshadowing how he talks about rulers and authorities a little bit later on in chapter 6. And so in all, he uses this phrase, heavenly realms, 5 times throughout his letter. He is really, really wanting his audience to see that there is something bigger going on, that there are larger forces at work than one would naturally assume. And not just that. He also really wants his audience to see how crucial it is that we understand that we are on this same grand stage. It's not merely that there's this unseen battle going on around us. We are in it. We are in the war. And so, one reason I think that Paul keeps returning to this theme over and over again throughout Ephesians for his ancient readers is that they probably had the same difficulty with this concept that we do. You remember that movie, The Usual Suspects? It's kind of a big hit back in the 90s, and it had this famous line that was in all of the trailers and such, and one of the main characters says, "The greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." And it's a really good line. It's a memorable line, and there's an awful lot of truth to it. If we are unwilling to accept the reality of our attacker, we are not going to be prepared for the attack. Or maybe for a lot of us, it's not exactly that it's complete denial, outright denial of Satan's existence. It's more of an incomplete awareness, or maybe even a casual dismissal of his influence. You know, maybe that goofy cartoon image of the horns and the cape and the trident and all that is just a little bit too seared into our unconscious. Maybe it's just a little bit too internalized, and so the whole notion just seems kind of silly and quaint and maybe far-fetched. But if any of that describes our attitude towards the devil, Paul would tell us that we are dangerously vulnerable to him. So I think that's exactly why Paul is addressing it directly in the final part of this great letter. Like any good coach, he wants to stress the importance of playing good defense. And readiness, preparation, is key to any successful defense. And so maybe we can say it like this. Good defense against our true enemy requires appropriate acknowledgement of his existence and appropriate awareness of his methods. Appropriate acknowledgement and appropriate awareness. We'll get to the appropriateness part in just a little bit. First, I want to talk about acknowledgement and awareness. And it's here that the sports metaphors they're just begging to be used here. I can't resist them, and so apologies, but I'm going to go for it this morning. Any good coach, as I just said, when she's preparing her team to defend against an opponent, she's going to do a couple of things. She's going to, first of all, instruct the team to have a healthy respect for what that opponent is capable of. And then she's going to go on to educate the team about the opponent's offense. And I think that's exactly what Paul is doing for us right here. He's saying, look, the devil's real. You need to acknowledge that. And you need to be aware that he is actively and constantly scheming to separate you from God. And so when he lists then the specific pieces of spiritual armor in the subsequent verses that are at our disposal, we can understand that their attributes directly counter the game plan of the opponent. So when he tells us to put on the belt of truth, we know then that that's because Satan's number one tactic is to lie to us all the time. By any means necessary, he's going to lie to us online and on social media and through our own insecurities. He's going to lie about anything and everything. We need truth at our disposal. When Paul says to fit our feet with the readiness of the gospel, well, then we can surmise that the devil is going to push us towards inaction and complacency. If we need a shield of faith, and if we need a helmet of salvation, well, then we know that that's because Satan is constantly trying to sow seeds of doubt and fear in our minds. C.S. Lewis wrote a fantastic book that's really all about this idea of appropriate acknowledgement and awareness of the devil and how he operates. It's called The Screwtape Letters. It is so well worth your time. I know many of you have read it. If you haven't, you should. It's one of my very favorite books of all time. I keep coming back to it just time and time again. Lewis has this rare gift of being able to take big ideas and to express them in impressively concise and simple ways. I have a different gift, incidentally. I can take small ideas and express them in needlessly verbose and complicated ways. And so it's a less appreciated, maybe less helpful gift, but to each his own. Anyway, this is a great book. It's a short little book, and the conceit of it is that it's a correspondence. It's written as a correspondence between two demons or two tempters. And the senior of these, whose name is Screwtape, is writing this series of letters to his young understudy named Wormwood, and he's instructing him in these letters how to effectively lead his human target away from God. That's the whole premise of the book. And it's creative, it's funny. Most of all, it has incredible insights about the natures of both God and Satan. It's about the specific ways that the devil works to drive a wedge between us and God. And it's about how God continually bolsters us and keeps calling us back to Him. And so each letter focuses on a different way that the tempters work on us and work to separate us from God. And one of Lewis's main premises in the book is just how often Satan traffics in the mundane. How he works on us in ways that are really unassuming and not flashy or grandiose, which makes them all the more insidious and difficult to detect. And I could quote this book all day long, but I want to give you one or two as an example. So in this chapter where Screwtape is talking about how to use things like distraction and boredom and seemingly minor transgressions against us, he has this to say about the dark potential of those things. Again, he's writing to his junior apprentice here. He says, "You will say that these are very small sins, and doubtless, like all young tempters, you are anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness. But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy." Of course, he's talking about God there. "It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts." What a striking way to reinforce Paul's warnings in Ephesians 6 about the schemes of the devil. While Satan can, and while he certainly will, work through the obviously tragic and evil circumstances of the world at large and even in our personal lives, he's probably at his most dangerous and his most effective when he is working in the shadows. When he's operating on the facets of our lives, our temperaments, our behaviors, our beliefs, our attitudes that might be a little bit less examined and thus less protected. He would rather we be unalerted to his presence, which is why Paul is exhorting us to readiness, to an acknowledgement of the devil's reality and an awareness of his machinations in our lives. If you remember that quote that we put up just a moment ago from The Usual Suspects, it's a great line, it's a memorable line, but it's not a wholly original one. In his preface to the Screwtape letters, Lewis says this: "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve their existence." So that's where we've been for the last few minutes. We've been talking about the importance of acknowledgement and awareness of our enemy. But the second error, according to Lewis, is equally dangerous. He says, "The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them." And so that's where this appropriateness part comes in. Acknowledgement and awareness, those things are definitely necessary and needed if we're going to be adequately prepared to face the enemy, but there is no need to excessively fixate on Satan. That is not healthy either. And so if I can go back to the sports well just one more time, there's a point at which focusing on one's opponent kind of tips over into counterproductiveness. My son Bodie plays basketball, and I've noticed over the last few years in playing basketball games, that occasionally when his team's about to play a good team, he and his teammates will spend an inordinate amount of time leading up to the game talking and texting about just how good this other team supposedly is. "Oh, these guys are really big, they're really good, they're one of the best teams around." And they'll do this a lot so that by the time the game actually arrives, they've psyched themselves out. They end up playing poorly and without any confidence. And so we've had conversations after games where I've said, "Look, I watched the game. You guys were every bit as good, maybe even better than those guys, but you lost the game before it ever started. And it's the same with our spiritual opponent. There's an appropriate level of attention that we need to give him, but beyond that, we're only hurting ourselves. And so I think that's really important for us to take away this morning, because I actually believe that's really the main point that Paul's trying to get across here in this part of the letter. The reason that we don't need to fixate excessively on the devil is because we absolutely have the armor at our disposal that's needed to defeat him. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert. And so we've spent a good part of today's message talking about the devil, because maybe we don't do that quite enough. But the message today, Paul's message in Ephesians chapter 6, is actually one of great confidence and triumph. When we are both ready and reliant, we can resist. So with clear eyes, we've got to understand that Satan is going to take every opportunity to feed us lies that, if we do buy into them, are going to pull us away from God. He is going to exploit your personal tragedy, your own loss, to try to nudge you into despondency and cynicism and bitterness. He's going to use your loneliness to create a well of self-pity in you that will drive a wedge between you and God. He will distract you with diversions that might seem significant, but that actually are pretty empty and unfulfilling and maybe even kind of soul-draining. He'll play on your pride and your stubbornness and your busyness to push you away from empathy and compassion towards others. He'll do anything he can to win you, but guess what? So will God. And God's power and might puts Satan's to shame, makes his pale in comparison. God just asks that we remember and that we hold on to what he's given us, the truth of who he is, the peace that comes with knowing what Christ did to rescue us, the knowledge of God's justice and righteousness, the guiding light of his inspired words. Those are the things that Jesus himself hung on to when he was out in the desert, and the devil was trying every angle that he could think of to make Christ stumble. But in that moment, Christ's readiness and truth and faith and Scripture won the day, and Satan crawled off in the face of Jesus' resistance. And those tools are ours to use as well. When I was studying this passage in preparation for today's lesson, my thoughts kept returning to my friend Todd. Todd is a member here at Memorial Road, and he gave me permission to talk about this today. And he's a good man, and he has had a difficult road in a lot of ways. He's made some bad choices like we all do, and he's faced some really, really tough circumstances as a result. I called him the other day just to check on him, see how he was doing, and he was angry. He was just angry. There's no other way to say it. He's working really hard right now to live right and to make good decisions. But he told me that he's not seeing a lot of fruit from that right now in his life. He's not at peace in his mind a lot of the time. And frankly, he's frustrated that it just seems like God isn't hearing him. It seems like he's not answering his prayers. And I so appreciate Todd being willing for me to share that with you today, because it's raw and it's real. It's just real. Here's a man who's in the battle. And Satan is trying to get to him. He's poking him. He's prodding at all his vulnerabilities, trying to pull him away. And maybe you can relate to that. In your honest moments, maybe you can relate to it. I can't. I haven't been through everything that Todd has. I haven't had the same kinds of experiences that he has. But I can relate to those moments of frustration and anger and unfulfillment. At the end of that conversation, after he kind of poured out a lot of that frustration. He said something that hasn't left my mind, that I've just kept coming back to time and again. Despite his disappointment and his anger, he said to me, yeah, but you know, I'm going to keep reading my Bible. I'm going to keep going to church, even if I don't feel like it. I'm going to keep talking to God, even if I am yelling at him some of the time. And I told Todd a few days later that I couldn't get that part out of my mind, especially as I was reading Paul's words about the armor of God. He's under attack. He's feeling low. He's feeling unfulfilled. He's feeling just mad at life, but he's leaning on his salvation. He's leaning on the decision that he made to follow Jesus Christ. He's leaning on his faith in God's goodness and power. He's leaning on Scripture and on prayer. He's trusting that God is going to do what he said he will do, even though it's really hard for him to see it in the cards right now. And I find that so moving, and I find it so inspiring to my own faith. You know, James said, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Todd's resisting. He's resisting. And you can too. Just a moment, we're going to stand up and we're going to sing together, and I'll invite anyone who wants to come down and share any way that our church family can be of help to you. Maybe we can pray for you for whatever's going on. We'd love to do that. If you'd like to be baptized this morning, we would love to do that. If you are ready to commit your life to following Christ, in just a moment you'll be invited to come down here to the front and share with us as we sing together. First, though, I'd like to ask everybody to stand up if you would, and I'd like you to read with me. I'd like you to read aloud with me these great words of hope and encouragement as we close today. This is the bottom line. I hope that these words give you peace. If you'll read out loud with me together. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand.